name is Judah. I'm your chair for this round. I also have a stellar panel with me here today, and I'd like to ask them to introduce themselves from left to right.
Vansh here. Congratulations on this.
Daughter, congratulations. Best of luck.
Chelsea, congratulations and good luck.
Rushdoon, congratulations and good luck. I'm Vansh, good luck.
Pranav, good luck.
Andrea, congratulations and all the best.
Auguste, all the best.
Great. For the government side, please share their speaking order and pronouns as well if they'd like. And feelings as well.
Kavindra going first, reply. Second, Wailer, third, we veto motion 2.
Thank you to the government. And then the opposition side, would you please also share speaking order, pronouns if you'd like, and your motion to veto.
Hi everyone, my name is Yiing, I'm going first, Cavan's going second, Rhea's going third, and Cavan's doing the reply speech. We vetoed motion 1, so we're doing that one.
Great. And the motion we're debating for the grand final reads, in states facing armed insurgencies, this House supports the deployment of private military and security contractors, e.g. the Wagner Group, Blackwater, G4S, etc., and all critical resource extraction sites in exchange for joint control. With that out of the way, I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister to start off the debate. Hear, hear.
Sorry, before I start, I just want to give a quick shout out to 2 circuits that I've been representing. First would be the Sri Lankan circuit, which I was brought up in. I know there's nobody here, but in case anyone ever watches this, that was the circuit that brought me up. And then also the Singapore circuit that took me in when I came to university, and everyone there, all my mentors, from way back in the day to even more recently, people like Sean, Cavan. Big shout out to the NUS contingent also. It's a great honor to be here. Alright, I'll take my speech in a minute. Panel. Armed insurgencies refer to things like militias, for example, who are portions of the military that split off to form their own groups, or radicals like Islamic radicals or terrorists that have ideological differences with the state and don't recognize state authority. This looks like terrorist organizations like ISIS or Taliban, or the armed insurgencies in places like Sudan, for example, that continue the genocides against Hutus. The incentives of these groups is to A, gain more power and influence, to control areas and people and spread their ideologies, but B, finances, to control resource extraction sites, so like mines, for example, to get the money from there to fund the conflict, but also for their own personal enrichment, which is why many of these armed insurgent groups target resource extraction sites as areas that they want to strategically control. The states that often have these groups tend to be poorer states that are often incapable of defending their borders because their armies are weak, which is what allowed these armed insurgencies to rise up in the first place. It is in this situation that we think states should actually contract with private military corporations. Why are these contracts likely to be good? The first is just competition. There are so many PMCs like Wagner, Blackwater, GS5, Executive Outcomes in South Africa, which means governments have a decent amount of bargaining power with negotiating the contracts to keep them joint control of resources. So this looks like, for example, giving them a percentage of the revenue of the resources that are sold from these places. But these don't also have to be forever. They could be time-based, for example, and they could be phased out so government retains control after a period of time. There could also be provisions, for example, in these contracts that specify that PMCs should help build state militaries over time in return for this control. Second, we think they can be held accountable because PMCs have an incentive to maintain an image of professionalism nationalism, because that affects their ability to get future contracts. Because for states to be able to sell this to people, they need to be able to, PMCs need to have a reputable image to get contracted with states. Thirdly, like the reason we need to use mineral resources is because it's often the only thing that states have to bargain with. They're often cash strapped and therefore cannot pay up front. Two arguments in this speech. First, why we can actually beat the insurgents and end the war faster, and why that's actually good. First, how can we actually, why are PMCs better than state militaries, which is the alternative, at fighting these insurgents? 4 structural reasons. One is training. The fact is PMCs tend to be battle-hardened like military men. So like South Africa's executive outcome PMC, for example, were people who are formerly from like the 32nd Battalion who have actual military experience fighting in actual wars. Second, they get better training. So like Blackwater was founded by Eric Prince, who was a former Navy SEAL that benefited from US military training in a way that no other state could do. The point is the comparative state armies are a lot worse because they just have much less battle experience, since many states don't fight wars on a regular basis. But also they're much poorer or inexperienced, means they have worse training and therefore they have worse training. This is important because the battlefield is a situation in which you are confronted by things like frenzy and confusing and stressful, which means absent training is when soldiers resort to their most base animalistic instincts of unfettered violence. It is on our side that through training and experience, PMC soldiers are better able to resist those urges and are much better incentivized to act professionally. Secondly is resources. PMCs tend to be a lot richer as a result of the military contracts they got in the past, fighting in past wars, and that's going to afford things like better weapons, better soldiers, better armor, for example, for soldiers, which is likely to just make them a lot more effective. But also, better weapons and newer weapons tend to be more targeted weapons rather than the older, more kind of shoot-in-the-dark weapons, which means you have less collateral damage at the point at which you have better weapons on our side of the house as well. Third structural reason, military indoctrination. Because the way states get people to join militaries is through nationalistic rhetoric that tells them that dehumanizes many insurgent groups by painting them as banally evil and should be exterminated, by creating fear, by convincing people of the existence of an existential threat. And insofar as state soldiers spend a lot of time in training, they get indoctrinated by this rhetoric. This is important because soldiers of the state on their side are far more likely to therefore commit crimes of passion, like needless killings, like brutally entering and massacring entire villages or raping or murdering civilians because of that indoctrination. PMCs, on the other hand, are far more professional because they are motivated by profit. So they have no incentive to commit things like war crimes or prolong the conflict by like randomly going into like killing villages after they've exterminated like combatants, because they're motivated by profit. The faster they can get out of there, the more profit they make. The fewer bullets they use, the more profit they make. This means that profit incentive is what reduces those kinds of passion. Thirdly, PMCs also have no incentive to prolong the conflict because their profit incentives in their ability to mine and benefit from the mineral resources, which they get access to only once the conflict ends, because while they're still fighting, you can't mine, which means they have a profit incentive to end the conflict faster. What are the impacts of this? First, it means the state is more likely to win the war, because in the alternative, when the insurgents win, the insurgents retain control of these mines, which is bad, because A, on the way up, on Gulf, at least on our side, you have joint control, which means the state benefits from some portion of the revenue that comes from these mines, whereas on their side, if the insurgents have control, the state gets no revenue. Secondly, you empower the insurgents, because at the point which they have access to those minerals, they can then use that funding to buy newer weapons and become more powerful and conquer even more land and take over even more civilians, which is a far greater threat to the state. The second impact is that you also just end the war faster. This has two impacts. The first is that you need stability to mine mineral resources, because in order to attract investment, for example, and develop the mines, you need stability and security to have sustainable mining so that like your mining equipment doesn't get blown up, for example, through constant fighting in the region. Which means on our side is that when you end the war faster, the state can now actually begin mining the resources, whereas on their side, prolonged conflict delays the extent to which states can mine the resources. So even if the state can win and retains control of the mines on their side, there's a significant delay on their side before they can actually begin mining. Secondly, is that you just have less collateral damage. This means A, fewer lives lost at the point where the conflict ends faster. B, it means more infrastructure preserved and less infrastructure damage. More stability in your country, which allows you to attract more foreign direct investment, for example, to actually create infrastructure, to actually give people jobs. This is important as a means of, like, people don't just die from conflict, they also die of poverty and starvation, which we reduce on our side of the house. Thirdly, it's easier to have reconciliation because at the point at which you have less harm done, there are less wounds that need to be mended. So for example, on their side, if the conflict goes on longer between say ethnic groups, that means it's more likely that like the other ethnic group guy killed my father and therefore I'm less willing to reconcile because there's more collateral damage. At least on our side when the conflict ends faster, there's less harm done and therefore it's easier to get reconciliation as well, to get post-conflict rebuilding. Panel, wars are inevitable. PMCs are the most effective way to end those wars faster and begin post-conflict rebuilding. Very proud to propose.
Thank you to the Prime Minister for that fine speech. Now I'd like to welcome the Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear.
Hi everyone, just a few shout-outs before I start my speech. Firstly, to NUS debates. Thank you for generously taking me in and mentoring me when real NUS debates shut down around me. Thank you also to my friends in both the Malaysian and Singaporean debate circuits, who do me the honor of making me feel welcome in not one, but two world-class circuits. Thank you. Secondly, shout out to my students from UWC and St. Nick's, whom I know watch these recordings. Thank you for always driving me to do better and to try and be a good example for you guys. You sometimes tell me that you hope you make me proud. You always have. And I hope that this speech makes you proud as well. Finally, to my wonderful partner, Irfan. You have been my rock through the highs and lows of this sport. Sorry for taking so long. I'll be back soon. I will now start my speech. Three questions in this speech. Firstly, what are alternatives and how are they available? Secondly, why alternatives are better for ending conflict earlier? And lastly, even if their options are better, why is this bad? Firstly then, on what are alternatives and why they are better? We will suggest that we agree that in many instances, local militias are impoverished. However, we will suggest two alternatives to replace this. Number one, international organizations such as the UN and regional organizations that often provide troops in order to make up for the shortfall. This is because regional neighbors often contribute to joint military operations and are structurally incentivized to do this because they want to avoid spillovers in terms of refugees, disruptions to local trade, because these are your closest trading partners. For example, Rwanda is the world's largest provider of peacekeepers because they want to avoid international instability in regional areas. Secondly, direct military aid. This could look like from America. Trump has alienated a large number of their trade allies and therefore need to find rare earth minerals and minerals from elsewhere in order to make up for the shortfall. But even if America is stepping back from the world stage, we will suggest that the EU and China can step in. The EU has recently pledged $1 trillion to defense spending and also wants to find alternative sources of trade aside from America because it is a less reliable ally now. But also China similarly has an increasing need to defend its monopoly over rare earth minerals for its high-tech sectors, such as EVs. It has a strong incentive, therefore, to provide aid and military equipment and possibly even troops in exchange for future trade. This means that in many instances, we receive military equipment. This looks like anti-infantry defense systems, mines, and short-range missiles that can take out rebel insurgents. Or it also looks like troops on the ground and manpower that can just make up for the shortfall on our side of the house. They can provide joint military training that can overcome this problem. We have alternatives as a result. I will now discuss why alternatives are better. Three structural reasons for this. The first is that they are far less likely to kill and brutalize civilians. This is for two reasons. Number one, PMCs are just far less accountable. They are private organizations and therefore allowed to maintain trade secrets over the operations manuals, training process, and specific accountability mechanisms. I recognize that Kavindra said you can shop around and try and select for a better one. But the barrier of entry to opening a PMC is exceedingly high. You need a mass number of individuals who are military trained. You need mass amounts of military equipment. Clearly then, this is not a free market, it is a monopsony market. And when markets are more oligopolistic and more monopsonic, they have a high tendency to collude, to not have better options available. So if every PMC gives you a bad option, you have to pick bad options as a result. Secondly, in the comparative, defense secretaries, generals, and foreign ministers are elected. These are individuals who are at the head ultimately of armies, and therefore the military command structure is ultimately accountable to civilians or individuals who are elected by civilians. This means that there are just abilities for civilians to check these organizations, either through the direct power of electing different individuals or having these individuals be accountable to civilian leadership such as prime ministers and presidents. These are individuals who can conduct inquiries in a far more transparent manner than in private organizations, which are just insulated because of the reasons I laid out earlier. Secondly, however, they are incentivized to be less brutal. No, these private organizations are incentivized to be brutal to extend the conflict even longer. This is because the longer the conflict goes on, the more they can mine. And I know, like Kavindra says, you can only mine when the conflict ends. This is not true. It's not like in a war zone or in a country going to war, every specific area is a war zone. In fact, the mines being armed is so that they can carry out destruction without this. Now, the intuition check here is that the reason why insurgents want to take over the mines is so that they can mine materials, right? That suggests that they can still conduct mining while the conflict is still going on. Otherwise, these critical resource extraction points are useless to insurgents and the government alike. This means that the longer the conflict goes on, the longer these organizations are needed and the more resources they can extract. Well, thank you. That's why they're structurally incentivized to be more brutal, to kill more civilians. When they're taking over mines, these aren't just isolated outposts, these are towns and settlement areas where you need workers and people to support these workers. These are individuals you need to subjugate and oftentimes you will brutalize in the process. No. Now, to be clear, these are individuals who are less professional on our side. But these are also individuals who can be sent from foreign areas and therefore likely have some amount of combat experience, use weapons that are more high-tech and therefore more specific in seeking out, for example, enemy combatants. These are far better than. Number one, this does decrease the killing of civilians. But number two, it simply means that there's less recruitment for insurgent groups, the point at which fewer civilians are killed and therefore inspire hatred towards the national government, etc. Sure.
Surely there is no incentive to extend the conflict because once the conflict ends, the PMC gets control of the minerals for a period of time after that. Extending the conflict means you just spend more money fighting the conflict. There's no incentive for the PMC to do that.
So you can extract more resources during the process of the conflict and therefore get more money as the conflict goes on. Second push, therefore, on why this requires less extraction in the here and now. And I think that this answers that question very, very well. PMCs are more short-termist. This is because they need immediate returns. They are held accountable by asset managers such as Blackwater, which themselves can pull out and invest in other things, or whose investors can pull out and invest in other things, which are just giving more returns in the here and now. This means that they need extraction to occur immediately and during the conflict. Compare this to countries which are more long-termist, who are willing to wait for the conflict to be over before getting their spoils. Now, this team might say, well, they are beholden to short-term election cycles. I have two responses. Number one, election cycles are often long. They are periods of, for example, 5 to 10 years. We can hold out beyond that. But number two, national parties and foreign ministers are more capable of continuing the policy aims of previous administrations as compared to the extremely short-term incentives of their side of the house. The third structural reason why this doesn't prolong conflict is just that insurgent groups are more hesitant to attack local troops and foreign troops. Other countries whose leaders are known to be outraged and send more troops in response, or their own soldiers and their own people, and therefore individuals that they feel more allegiance to. This means that on their side of the house, insurgent groups are more willing to brutalize individuals in these mines. What are the benefits here? On our side of the house, when we are able to ensure that mining and the spoils of mining go to governments can use these resources to help their people, fund aid and welfare systems that oftentimes buffer against insurgent groups being able to recruit and get more support. On their side, the need to appease foreign companies means that the money goes to them rather than critical services that help keep our country afloat and help deprive insurgents of recruitment. Second, the last thing I'm going to talk about is why even our alternatives are less effective at keeping insurgent groups at bay. Why is this still better? This is because insurgent groups aren't always evil. They often exist as a result of governments neglecting or oppressing ethnic minorities. They therefore often have legitimate political and social goals. Think about the Tigray Liberation Front, the Irish Republican Army, or Hamas, which fights back against Israeli apartheid and genocide. On our side of the house, when these insurgent groups gain these outposts, these are often critical points at which governments can react and provide concessions to these organizations rather than necessarily prolonging the conflict. On their side of the house, therefore, they brutalize more civilians. They prolong the conflict for longer. That's why we're so proud to oppose.
Thank you to the Leader of Opposition for that fine speech. Now I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. Here, here.
Alright, as everyone else has done, before my speech I just wanted to talk about shout-outs. First is to the Singapore circuit as a whole, and especially NUS for giving me so much guidance and support. It's such a privilege to be able to stand here in my first year, and it's just a proof of how strong we are as a circuit and how much better we'll become in the future. To seniors like Sean, who have come down to give us feedback and training, and to the seniors who are standing at this very table, who sometimes care about the contingent more than themselves, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. Lastly, and most importantly, I want to thank my greatest source of debate inspiration, my girlfriend Ashley. I know how much effort you put in to learn and improve, and I'm so confident you'll be one of Asia's best to become. When it's your turn to stand on this stage, I'll cheer the loudest in the room for you. Now, on to the stage. Opposition must take a side in this motion. If insurgents are really very good, as you believe by the end of Yiing's speech, they get wiped out by the best case scenario under their side, so clearly both sides of the case cannot coexist. The first thing I'll do at the top of this speech is dismantle a large amount of the assertions that comes out from Yiing, because both of them just aren't true. The first is why PMCs are actually structurally more accountable. The first reason for this is that many PMCs are contracted by governments and receive government funding and government contracts. This explains to you that many of them have reputations to uphold. The fact that, for example, when massacres happen by groups like Blackwater, they will instantly cut funding or instantly cut licenses by the US Department of Defense in Iraq when it was invading Iraq. This explains to you that many of them do have accountability mechanisms towards the states that provide towards them. Secondly, there's heavy amounts of state monitoring and state regulation by employers. Even if you don't believe this, mercenaries are not national soldiers, and so they're shielded from litigation. This explains to you, for example, that soldiers' families sued, for instance, in the case of Colombia, when there was active forms of PMC involvement and which was war crimes were committed. This explains to you that these people are more able to be held accountable by legal mechanisms. Thirdly, there's currently a crisis of legitimacy that many PMCs face. The fact that there's heavy public scrutiny because of things like Wagner and many shady PMCs have actively done harm towards the states that they're involved in, explains to you that many countries are now hesitant to involve PMCs within their militaries in the first place. This explains to you that many of them need to preserve images and preserve optics in order to maintain legitimacy within these conflicts. This explains to you, therefore, that PMCs ultimately have a vested incentive to reshape their image towards professional soldiers rather than just thugs with guns. And it explains to you that there's a vast accountability mechanism that exists towards them. The main line of attack that comes out from opposition is to suggest that there's a higher barrier to entry. This is untrue. There's actually a lower barrier to entry because there are many decommissioned soldiers who aren't able to adjust back to civilian life who are looking for the ability to maintain employment within the military scale. This explains, for example, in December 2006, there were massive amounts of 100,000 PMCs who were involved in Iraq by the US who were set to compete with one another to be the best involved within this form of task force. This explains to you that all the things they talk about on how PMCs are unaccountable or there's a lack of competition, no thank you for. Let's analyze the alternatives they give to you. The The first is UN and regional neighbors. And I want you to just gut check this. This probably doesn't work for a couple of reasons. The first is they definitely cannot get boots on the ground, because that's the most unpopular solution. You cannot actually send people to die in a foreign conflict. It's incredibly difficult for you to do. It's incredibly domestically unpopular. Secondly, many of these nations have more proximate domestic concerns. For example, cost of living, for example, maintaining their economy, which means that diverting resources towards external funding is only political suicide. It's likely to get your government voted out. Even if the case that these alternatives work, however, it opens up the chances of proxy conflicts, especially as Yiing says that China and the US have active incentives to intervene because of things like rare earth minerals. It is likely the case that when you involve foreign powers, they compete with one another to gain control of these mines, and it opens up and elongates conflicts to become even worse. Even if it's a case that only one of them takes control, they are likely to be even more exploitative. Think about, for example, when Trump actively made aid towards Ukraine conditional on giving massive amounts of resources and minerals because he knew that Ukraine was relying on US aid for these sorts of systems. All of this explains to you that alternatives are just significantly more exploitative, even in their best case scenario. No, thank you. Secondly, as I already explained, they're significantly more accountable, meaning that PMCs are just significantly better. We have more abilities to hold these agencies to account. Even if you don't believe they are more accountable, you should at least believe that this clash is symmetrized. Lastly, do they actually have incentive to end it faster or slower? They say that they have incentive to end it slower because they want to exploit resources. This doesn't work for two reasons. The first is, as already stated in the POI, they already gain control of these mines after the conflict ends, meaning they already have the ability to have these resources. They're already doing small extraction. They actively incur more costs during the conflict. Secondly, I'll prove to you that extraction is actually really difficult to do during the active conflict. The first is that you often need to get foreign investment to aid in things like mining, which is very difficult to do in a conflict-ridden war zone. Secondly, you can get easily targeted. If you have people actively mining the resources, it's significantly easier for you to be targeted by insurgent attacks like drone strikes and bombs. All of this explains to you that it's incredibly difficult to do extraction during an active conflict. They do not engage in comparative. The last thing they say is that PMCs are short-termist. This is just untrue. The reason for this is that many PMCs are backed by major firms, as they explain themselves. They have massive amounts of funding that are able to tide over the short term, where they actually gain resources in the long term and prospective ties, in the long term and preserving their reputation so more people are turning towards them, as I explained in my earlier clash. All of this explains to you that PMCs do not invest in incentive in exploiting every country right now, because they know that that's what gets them out of contract. They know that's what gets countries to deny PMCs into their countries in the first place, but they have to look into the long term and preserving their image and optics and reputation. That's where the money actually lies. All of this explains to you at the end of my speech that even if you don't buy anything else, PMCs are still accountable. PMCs are to go with that high competition, which ensures they are less exploitative, and it's likely the case that the end of conflict significantly faster. Before I move on,
According to your own analysis, your governments only hire PMCs with a long track record of success and cleanliness. Doesn't that imply that new up-and-coming PMCs find it difficult, if not impossible, to break into this monopoly space?
okay, so one, I've already explained how the barriers to entry is low, so even if there's a high track record of success and actually more exploitative, you can always switch to alternatives. Secondly, if the PMC is a high track record of success, then take the money. That clearly seems like a win for outside. I don't understand what POI is going for. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you should buy two mechanisms that you have put forward. Firstly, wars end significantly faster. We explained how there's a greater capacity that PMCs have as opposed to state actors. Secondly, PMCs want to end the war as soon as possible. They want to elongate the conflict. What they get under the other side is insurgents potentially seizing control of mines. And you need to buy this. Because even if the case that we end the war slightly faster, there's a chance under the other side that insurgents are able to gain control of these crucial territories. Why was this particularly bad and a chance we could not afford? Firstly, it increased the performance legitimacy of insurgents. Insofar as they're able to gain greater resources, they're able to justify their good, they're able to fund their industrial war complex to a greater degree, meaning they're able to subjugate individuals or gain more people on their side. This is significantly important because they gain greater control of rural areas, for example. Secondly, insurgents just gain greater resources to fight against the state. It's been elongating conflicts with more wars, more weapons, greater guerrilla warfare. These are all things that are unconscionable in the round. All this explains to you that in a certain benefit under side government, we must end wars faster because there's greater capacity to do so and they have the incentive to do so. Both of these things are significantly proven under government bench. We end wars faster. But secondly, the second part of the victory had was that wars were better and more humane. The fact that less lives were caused and there was earlier reconstruction because there's an incentive among PMCs to be humane because they have profit incentives, because they prioritize efficiency, because they prioritize optics. The clear gut push here is that efficiency is often diametrically opposed to war crimes. Because war crimes requires you to spend more time within a region, requires you to do more assaults, more rapes within that region. That's significantly more harmful towards people. Efficiency means ending the war faster, meaning you're more likely to be merciful towards civilians, you're more likely to be less aggressive in the ways that you end conflicts. All of this explains that in the second part of the victory, even if the conflict is the same under both sides, the ways in which conflict is waged under our side is significantly more humane because there are professional standards that these companies are held to. The fact that they have optics, the fact that there's competition means that there's greater capacity for countries and turn towards other PMCs that significantly better treating towards them. At the end of this speech, you just need to buy a couple of very simple things. Firstly, competition because there's lower barriers to entry. Secondly, we have less life loss and we have earlier reconstruction for the people who need it within these countries. And thirdly, we can never let these mines come to the control of insurgents who will use it to extend conflicts and ruin lives. For these reasons, full government.
Thank you to the DPM for that fine speech. Now I'd like to welcome Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here, here.
If I speak at this volume, is it okay? Firstly, on the civilian death toll, Yiing explains that PMCs launch brutal onslaughts onto civilian populations that live near extraction sites, for example, mining towns near cobalt mines. This is often done under the guise of weeding out remaining extremists that are hiding in the town. PMCs uniquely have high military capacity due to funding from major global powers and the fact that they get powerful military equipment from the military-industrial complex. This means that the scale of devastation is massive and creates asymmetric warfare because of the indiscriminate use of weapons. PMCs are uniquely unaccountable. National armies are beholden to the conventions of war. Governments don't want to be accused of war crimes to face international sanctions or possible trials at the ICC. Kavindra and Whaler both says that PMCs are accountable. They say they care about their reputation, and they say we can contractually bind them and that government somehow want to control PMCs. I have 5 responses. The first, this is wrong. States are usually weak and unstable. They have no leverage to demand certain terms from the PMCs. Second response is that governments like America or Russia usually are more occupied with other domestic issues and not really willing to negotiate the terms of these contracts with the PMCs and other dictatorships. Third response, being brutal is often a selling point. State wants PMCs to unleash chaos to regions that they perceive as a terrorist breeding ground. So this flips their mechanism of reputation because being brutal actually is what makes you stand out compared to other PMCs. Fourth responses, these PMCs are often foreigners. So for example, they're Russians and Americans and they're ex-military or they're veterans. They don't see those ethnic insurgents or civilians as humans, so they act in more dehumanized ways. Fifth response, if government regulation exists, this is an incentive to cover up atrocities, not to actually comply by the rules. So this creates an incentive to hide things like the war crimes we've done. Actually, I have 6 responses. Lastly, military equipment is incredibly expensive. There's things like guns and artillery are really expensive, so there's high upfront costs, which means that this is often a monopoly, not one where you can pick and choose which contractors you get. On two-way metrics, we are currently ahead. Even if our alternatives are less efficient and less well-funded, we explain that could be a good thing because having less strong weapons and having less troops actually de-escalates the conflict, which means that less civilians are caught in the crossfire. So on the most innocent and most vulnerable actors, they don't explain why efficiency is the most important thing. We explain that a low-stakes conflict actually allows civilians to not be caught in the crossfire. But secondly, on accountability, our alternatives just have check and balance mechanisms, regional discussions on what aid can be provided. For example, in the caucuses of the EU or an AU, they can decide specifically what weapons are being sent and how the weapons ought to be used, and withdraw the weapons in the cases where war crimes are undiscovered. On their side, governments typically deny association to the PMCs. So the Kremlin says we don't know what Wagner is doing, the US government says the Democrats say they don't know what Blackwater is doing. Governments don't have direct control over these contracts, and voters vote on other things like the cost of living or inflation, and not really what's happening in countries like Mali or Sudan. The reason why this impact is important is because it compounds with time. As more civilians die, this creates more anger from people, which feeds into extremist rhetoric, allowing insurgents to recruit more people and prolonging the conflict. This is why their side doesn't reach the benefit of stability, because when you start using PMCs and use such strong military force, that creates the exact rhetoric that extremists used to say, look at the state oppressing us, you ought to join us as a terrorist. Secondly, on weakening the national army. Private military contractors are incredibly expensive because they have a monopoly in this industry, especially for states that are already suffering from instability and economic problems. It is really difficult for them to afford private military contractors. Furthermore, private military contractors gain profits from resources extracted, lowering government revenue indefinitely into the future for the very reason that Kavindra himself provides about these states not having resources or revenue. This means that the government is permanently crippled indefinitely into the future to not gain money from resource extraction, even if they get their extraction benefit. Like they claim they can have the extraction of resources. The marginal profits they get from the extraction is incredibly low because the contract stipulates that Wagner or Blackwater gets the majority of the profit. This means less money to spend on the national army, paying soldiers and buying equipment. There are three impacts. Firstly, this creates path dependency. Having to always rely on PMCs in the future for every single conflict means that governments have a much higher military spending, a much higher military budget. Again, this creates other areas of conflict because if you have less money to spend on things like education and welfare and things like investing in businesses, this also creates more areas of instability outside of the ethnic insurgents. Secondly, absorbing ethnic minorities into the military is often the mechanism to heal ethnic divides and prevent them from joining insurgents. So when you can pay them a good salary, this is what prevents them from joining insurgents and prevents all of the rhetoric that extremists use to recruit them. So having a strong national army is actually what unifies people. Third impact, the profits go to Russia, who can use it to expand their influence and further the war in Ukraine. So when Kavindra says the national army is currently weak, that is our reason why we must invest more in the national army and not go down on this path dependency of just always relying on PFCs into the future. They don't answer the question on the long. Next question, who are the insurgents? Kavindra makes the fatal mistake of assuming that these insurgents are terrorists, but history is against them. Look at dictators like Assad in Syria using the Wagner Group, or Omar al-Bashir in Sudan, or in the cases of Mahdi under the dictator of Goita. All of the examples you point towards in history are not normal democratic governments using PMCs. It is dictators using PMCs to stamp out freedom fighters. This framing explains two things. Firstly, money from the resource extraction often goes to taking care of villagers. The reason is because ethnic insurgents only care about specific geographies where they have their ethnic groups at. They don't have ambitions to expand. But second implication is that these groups are often groups that can be negotiated with. For example, M23 in Congo is part of the Congo River Alliance, which is a political wing, which means that they often care about things like political representation or things like having constitutional protections. So this takes out their first harm about how the ethnic groups will use the resource to expand and do more chaos, but also explains Yiing's alternative of actually having ceasefires or peace agreements. Before I move on, yes?
Sorry, opposition needs to pick a side. In Yiing, they say the alternative is Chinese boots on the ground and US military aid, which means if the insurgents are good, they get killed either way on their side. These are still foreigners. I don't see what their case is about.
We are just talking about all of the different possible alternatives that can be used in all the different scenarios. It's called engagement. Now, on our worst case scenario, ethnic insurgents own mines, but their worst case scenario is the escalation of conflict. If ethnic insurgents see the state ramping up military activity, this creates an incentive for insurgents to get foreign funding from Iran, Russia, or Belarus. So what Wagner claims is the alternative to PMCs is actually what they create on their side of the house through an escalation of conflict, escalating localized conflicts to proxy conflicts with global powers. There are two implications of this. First, this affects democracy in the future where the foreign influence in the state and the rebel groups which neglects what people want on the ground, which is peace, because foreign powers want to protract conflict in order to maximize influence. But secondly, this team assumes that efficiency stems out insurgents, but these insurgent groups are like the Hydra. They have decentralized networks of recruitment, which means that they'll just strike again. This takes out their main benefit of stability. Wagner says proxy conflicts will happen anyways. This ignores regional alternatives like the AU. This ignores the EU using the Caucasus to negotiate things like ceasefires and agreements. But those anyways are more transparent where there are mechanisms like sanctions to stop states from doing this. They don't prove why they end the war against stability. They don't prove why it must be ended in this way compared to a lower stakes conflict. They don't explain why negotiations don't work. They don't explain why terrorists are there. They don't explain why these insurgents are not noble individuals. We get 9 ballots.
Thank you to the DLO for that fine speech. Now let's welcome Governor. Here, here.
A couple of shout-outs before I start my speech. To my parents who always watch my rounds, encourage me every step of the way, and who have funded an inordinate amount of debate trips. my friends from NUS and the rest of the Asian circuit, especially Rachel, Zed, and Joel for being there for me through everything. My students were the reason I continued university debating to be a competent coach. And of course, my brilliant teammates, Wayla, finalist as of his first UADC, and Kavindra, who's already kept UADC. It's about time he made the finals. There are two other people I'm deeply thankful for. The first is my favorite Malaysian, Yiing. After losing the UADC Octos together for the last 2 years, I wanted us to make this finals together, and I'm glad that we did, even if we're sitting on opposite sides of the stage for a change. I could not be happier that one of us will win UADC. And last but not least, Kavan, it's my turn to tell Asia what a good friend you are. I hope we stay friends for a long time more. And Kavan is very qualified, but too humble to advertise himself, so I will please go vote for him for a recap. The unfortunate thing about conflicts is that there are no good solutions, only less bad ones. I'm going to do 3 things in this speech. First, I'm going to examine the alternatives and the other actors. I'm going to talk about the behavior of PMCs, and then I'm going to explain why on the trade-off, even if they aren't the best actors, they provide critical short-term stability and can be phased out eventually, which allows for the state to capture resources at a point where they're significantly better. First, all the alternatives they mentioned on the other side of the house exist on our side also, though I do think they are worse, because as we look at the UN, it's a paper tiger that's often hamstrung by the UNSC, which means its ability and delta to intervene in conflicts is significantly low. If you want to look at regional actors, they are often poor or have limited capacity to intervene, precisely because they're in the same geographical position and therefore don't really have the capacity to have more advanced arms. Wayne also gave you a couple more reasons when he said sending boots on the ground is often the most limited options, and like domestic concerns are likely to take greater precedence. These are weighing that is significantly more important. But the thing I want to then note is that I flip this point, because if other actors are strong and you believe they are comparative, then this is good competition for PMCs. And this is an initial bet, even if you don't buy our claim that oligopolies are necessarily competitive. And this is where I'm going to flip the main thrust of their case, because they say other states will intervene because there is an incentive to want resources. Look at, for instance, Trump's deal with Ukraine on their rare minerals. What this means then is that exploitation is symmetric because those states are desperate, as they say, and they have to justify sending civilians to die, which means they're likely to want far greater and far better deals for this to be politically palatable to begin with, which means that in worse, what we have on our side is at least competition between these various actors. Insofar as states showing willingness to engage PMCs, governments also have the incentive to be less exploitative in how they engage with them. This is symmetric, but it's worse on the other side of the house. The tipping point and how you ought to weigh this clash is that the scale of aid is significantly better, stronger, and more prolonged on our side of the house. The first thing is that these are private contractors. They're not civilians and they're sending to die in a foreign land, which means that there is greater political appetite to be able to support these types of things. No, like for instance, Wagner doesn't just hire Russian individuals, there's Chinese, there's Africans, it's a variety of people. So all of that money is not necessarily going to Russia. The second is that they have specialized training to deal particularly with these types of conflicts that states may or may not necessarily have. And I want to note that in the long term, countries have limited appetite to continue fighting conflicts. Just look at what has happened so far. With the economic instability in the world today, the easier way to get resources is to strike a different deal. So for instance, look at Trump in Myanmar, look at US in the eastern region. All of this necessarily means that they don't prove why you're going to go to war when your military capacity is already stretched, because this is a far easier way of just getting resources from outside of the house. That's the first. The scale of aid is far better, it is more constant, and in terms of competition, we get better deals for everyone. Let's then engage with the PMC behavior. And this is where they wanted to mention, and the push from deputy is that we're okay with less troops, we're okay with less strong troops, because it de-escalates the conflict and you can negotiate with these terrorists or freedom fighters or whatever you necessarily want to call it. My question there then is de-escalate for who? Because a de-escalation of a conflict is not an a priori good, insofar as the people who are then likely to take over, be it whether or not they are good rebels or bad rebels, it's up to subjective interpretation to define, but those people who often seize control via military means are people who rule by military means, which means rule by insurgents. If they want to tell you why insurgents are good, it's not necessarily an a priori good for these countries to begin with. They then try to flip this claim and they say, but if you're a PMC and you want resources, then you will let the conflict go on for a long time because that's how you get those resources. No, control of resources is not dependent war lasting longer. In fact, it's easier to extract it if the war ends faster, because then you don't also have to spend money fighting the conflict, which is why it's going to happen on our side of the house. They then deny the accountability mechanisms we provide you when they say PM international negotiations and support are long-term, uncertain, and speculative. All these groups need to do is wait out other countries' risk appetite. So it's symmetric. If we state can't exercise full sovereignty or protect its people or economy, we think partial joint control is better than a complete loss of sovereignty. Abuse is possible, but regulation is, as opposing to losing these assets altogether. So proud, vote for government.
Thank you to the government whip for that fine speech. I'd like to welcome the opposition. Here, here.
Hello. Sorry, I'm recovering still, so if it's unfair, just let me know. Heard many shout-outs already, so I'm going to be quick. Thank you to NUS, thank you to Justin for being my biggest supporter. First, clash on why PMCs are likely to manage conflict poorly because they are unaccountable, and secondly, why our counterfactual is much better. Firstly, on PMCs. Under this first clash, government team says that the contracts are likely to be good, and under this we have two mechanisms. The first thing they say is that there is competition amongst different PMCs. I want to point out that we have responded to this since first. We have told you that the barrier of entry to these monopolies are likely to be high because Wagner Group is run by a Russian oligarch with direct ties to Putin. Therefore, you ought to believe that there is a requirement of some extent of state backing or huge capital to fund these sorts of endeavors. But secondly, operationally, I just want you to gut check this intuition coming from them because it's utterly nonsense. Operationally, these sorts of PMCs require vast amounts of capital to invest into extremely high-tech equipment and to remunerate very high-ranking veterans that they want to put in office on their side of the house. Secondly, just because there is competition doesn't mean that the other party in the negotiation has more bargaining power. This is because by their own admission, these states have very low capital, their reserves are not liquid, which is precisely why they are letting these individuals get control over these resource extraction sites as opposed to just funding them and giving them direct income remuneration. Therefore, you shouldn't believe that these states are in a position to shop around for the best or the most competitive PMC. You ought to believe that it is open information that these states are poor and therefore their negotiating power is necessarily going to be less. Two implications of this for the debate. Firstly, they give up significant control over each discrete instance of mines, over all of the extraction sites as stated in the info slide. They need to defend letting the PMCs have joint control, which is a significant amount of joint control over all extraction sites, and that's something they haven't discharged their burden of proof of. But the second thing to say, therefore, is that there will not be provisions on the contract saying that the PMCs must help train the local military officials. This is complete bogus. There's no reason as to why the state is in a bargaining position to do this. In fact, I would contend that's precisely like something that's very unfavorable to these PMCs and never going to be accepted, because these sorts of provisions are locked up into long-term contracts where they find it very hard to escape. So if they find that the remuneration is not sufficient or they realize the endeavor is not worth it anymore, they are unlikely to put themselves in this position. Secondly, they say that these individuals care about professionalism and repute, and therefore their contracts will get cut if atrocities are committed, so they won't commit atrocities. Firstly, this is an assertion. We can tell you that empirically, the US and Russia often hire PMCs precisely to subvert international human rights laws. This was like Wagner being employed by Russia to intervene in Mali to install a Russian-backed president to power. These are all reasons why you should believe that these PMCs do not have moral obligations to, let's say, not commit atrocities. But secondly, there are structural reasons as to why they will commit atrocities. Firstly, brutality is good because it's a visible key performance indicator. There is no reason why you should believe that on their side of the house, the PMCs have other means to showcase that they have effectively effectively manage conflict, you ought to believe that the most direct way in which you can show that you're effective as a military organization is to enact en masse violence and have huge amounts of dead bodies lying on the ground for you to show that you're actually effective. Therefore, we ought to say that the incentive is actually to commit more atrocity. The second subclash, therefore, is on whether PMCs end conflict faster or whether they have an incentive to protract the conflict. Note that this is their win condition as stated in Way Law, because they say that PMCs will end the conflict shorter because they want to extract the resources sooner. This is contingent on the premise that you can only extract the resources after. I'm unclear why this is the case, because not all conflict is literally concentrated at the site of the extraction. It's fair to say that conflict can spread vastly across the entire mining town onto supply chain routes, etc. So I'm unclear why this is the case. But secondly, even if they get the resources in the end, it is unclear why the PMCs urgently want the resources now and will treat the urgency of the resources and getting it now as opposed to increasing the quantum of resources they can get if they were to protract the conflict. Firstly, these organizations are extremely rich, therefore you ought not believe that they very urgently need the resources now. But secondly, if they were willing at the outset to put off the leverage and gain from the resources upon entering the contract, because on their side of the house, you enter the contract without immediate remuneration, you're willing to wait, let's say 5 to 10 years to actually get that control. It is unclear why these organizations will suddenly want the resources so urgently. We contend that our factorization is more likely. You're probably willing to set off the time you get the resources for the bigger pool and quantum of resources that you get by prolonging the conflict. So they say if it's expensive to prolong the conflict, it is unclear why this expense rates above the amount of money you're going to get if you get a bigger sum of control. Because firstly, these military organizations have an economies of scale, therefore it's not that expensive for them to protract the conflict. But secondly, you ought to believe that in the long term, having more control over extraction sites is a more long-term source of revenue that outweighs whatever expense they have to incur in the short term. Thirdly, on brutality and atrocity and whether these organizations are likely to be accountable. Kavindra says, they have more training, they are not state indoctrinated, therefore they're not going to be violent. The form of
Non-state actors are uncertain. For states who are desperate, your order just exploit more. For states who want brutality, state armies are less humane. PMCs are structurally more optically reliant and accountable.
Your side has not mechanized exactly why they're structurally more accountable. We have given many reasons why they're structurally less accountable, but our side wins ultimately because we nuance the spectrum of optionality that these states can turn to when it comes to the different types of insurgencies they are fighting. I want to move on to this point about brutality. They say that there's less violence. Firstly, rank and file soldiers within these organizations are recruited from prisons. They are not exactly highly trained. Secondly, there's no accountability institutionally because these corporations are shielded by confidentiality agreements because there's a huge amount of power and experience in terms of diverting blame away from themselves. So it's unclear why there's accountability on their side of the house. Even if you don't buy this, our alternatives are effective because they are able to defend mines from absolute terrorists, but they are not enough to defend legitimate freedom fighters on their side of the house. The reason why this is the case is because freedom fighters have more recruitment and there's also less state incentive or support or political will to fight or crack down against freedom fighters. There's less political buying to do these sorts of things because these individuals oftentimes have many sympathizers. So you ought to believe that even if they crack down on terrorists, they will unlikely be able to crack down on freedom fighters. The counter analysis on our side of the house is that the state appears weaker, but this appearance of weakness is something that's important for de-escalating conflict. It is important to show that you're willing to go to the negotiating table, willing to talk it out, and give these insurgents something that they want. And this is backed by Cavan's analysis, that oftentimes insurgents are not evil individuals that want to enact violence, they're politically oppressed minorities that want to have representation and want to have a say in the country. Therefore, never be crowded to oppose.
To the opposition group for that final speech. To close off the side of opposition, I welcome opposition reply. Hear, hear.
History is against this team. Wagner in Syria created a decades-long civil war that entrenched the brutal dictator, as they did in Sudan and Mali. This team's main path to victory is that the efficiency of PMCs will bring stability. They don't explain why efficiency leads to the end of conflict. We explain it fuels extremist rhetoric that leads to more recruitment. We explain that like the Hydra, they will strike back again and just recruit more people. They don't explain why efficiency is justified, because we pointed out it was just a euphemism for brutality. Asymmetric warfare, dehumanizing of civilians, and wanting a reputation of being brutal to attract customers. They gave us some vague mechanisms on accountability. We had 1 billion responses to their claims on this. 3 standouts. 1, voters need to know and care about what's happening in foreign countries. 2, governments need to have direct control over the operations of PMCs, but oftentimes governments don't associate that closely with PMCs. For example, the Kremlin denying allegations that Wagner is an arm of the government. But lastly, a lot of this information is just confidential and not made available to the public. Insurgents are not just terrorists, they are fighting against brutal oppression and can't make them go away by using Wagner to nuke them into the ground. They say it's fair when an insurgent gets controls of the mines, but they don't access this benefit on their side of the house. We gave you regional alternatives and international alternatives, and all these are easier to assemble against terrorists. So in the cases where it's really ISIS we're fighting, it will be very easy for us to coordinate an international task force to stomp out ISIS, which means that the most important parts of this debate are things like using it against ethnic insurgents that are fighting for a noble cause. We told you things like negotiations and peace agreements. They only wanted to respond to the alternatives that they liked and they thought were weak. They didn't respond to the actual breadth of alternatives that we provide you. We told you that these alternatives are cheaper, more transparent, more accountable, and less brutal. If you believe any one of these alternatives will win on a landslide, because we get more profits from resources extracted, because we don't get locked into these contracts with the PMCs. But we did them one better. We said that even if the ethnic insurgents control the mines, less civilians die, conflicts are not protracted, and ethnic insurgents genuinely care only about specific geographies, which means they don't have ambitions to expand and take over the entire country. And they also care about the towns they are having control over, because many of them actually come from these towns themselves. So they don't explain what's the harm over here of ethnic insurgents taking over the mines. But then they said it's about getting profits from the resource extraction. Yes, but we told you that the PMCs have a lot of leverage in these negotiations, which means they take a huge cut, which means that these insurgents will continuously sabotage infrastructure, not allowing you to extract any resources on their side of the house. So at best, they don't access this benefit because the war keeps going on and insurgents attack infrastructure. But even if you take them at their best, the benefit is incredibly marginal because the PMCs take like a 60% cut from whatever resources are extracted. But again, we did them one better. We explain how we get this benefit too. Because getting resource sharing agreements with insurgents in exchange for things like political protection, in exchange for things like constitutional protection, were things that they did not respond to on their side of the house. Lastly, on proxies. Escalation of conflict invites global powers to fund ethnic insurgents. The fatal mistake of this team is assuming that ethnic insurgents will roll over once Wagner comes in. But a lot of these people fight for causes that don't change. Things like wanting independence or things like wanting protection. Which means that when you push them into a corner, what happens is they become desperate enough to accept funding from things like Iran and Russia. The response they have here is, but these proxy conflicts will exist anyway. The point is, if they're not that desperate, the velocity to want to get those other forms of foreign funding is lower, but also they don't respond to the accountable forms of foreign funding, for example, regional alternatives like the AU or the EU, which doesn't invite the harms they talk about in terms of Russian funding or China. Lastly, Wheeler tries to attack our alternative in the POI, finally in the POI to weigh up, but this is again behind Ian and I, because we explain that national armies have a check and balance. And here's the kicker. Their mechanism that is constantly parroted throughout this debate is that governments will hold PMCs accountable. Guess what governments have direct control over? National armies. Guess what governments are beholden to? International communities where they might face sanctions or condemnation. So their one killer mechanism to control the PMCs actually proves all our alternatives for why national armies will be less brutal, more accountable, and more transparent.
Thank you for the opposition reply. And now to close off the debate, I'd like to welcome government reply. Here, here.
Alright, hello. Sorry guys, 4 more minutes and then give me. Okay, starting speech. 3, 2. The first thing I'm going to talk about is this case about what if the insurgencies are good. Because the case from that finally comes out in Yiing's POI to GovWeb is if we'll only be able to raise international support to combat the really bad insurgencies. This isn't actually any of their speeches if you look at their notes. But this is structurally untrue. Because firstly, like Yiing's analysis from ELO to explain why countries like US and China would get involved in these conflicts in the first place is that they are profit incentivized to access things like minerals. If that is true, that's not clear why they wouldn't also support bad governments against insurgencies to access the minerals in the way the US has historically done, right? Like the US funded the Mujahideen rebels because they wanted like resources in Afghanistan. They funded revolutions in the Middle East because they wanted access to oil. And all of these things, for example, are explanations of why they're not just morally driven as such. But second, this also doesn't explain, but Vela explains the problem is that even if the rebels were bad, sometimes there is disincentive against US or foreign intervention because of things like the body bag effect, because of the lack of political capital, especially in strategically insignificant conflicts, which is why the US didn't intervene in like the Rwandan genocide, which was probably the most justifiable place in which we should have seen intervention, but because it wasn't a strategically significant place, it didn't work. And that's the problem. That's why we can't rely on external actors. That's why we need more autonomy to the states that actually face this existential threat. Their case doesn't work. Let's talk about the alternatives. Because firstly, alternatives like negotiations and peace are just not mutually exclusive. Because if these are possible, states have no incentive to go to war and they would no incentive to have PMCs. There are other alternatives, and this is what they run away from. Because Yiing sets out the actual alternatives in ELO, which was one, US and China sending boots on the ground, and US and China sending military aid and weapons in return for access to resources. The harms of these are just symmetric though, because firstly, you're talking about boots on the ground. These are still foreign soldiers that don't care about locals and will commit war crimes. And if it's true that PMCs can cover up war crimes, surely these soldiers can also symmetrically cover up war crimes and evade accountability. Secondly, if it's military aid, these are still used by the state armies and therefore still fall prey to all the analysis that I brought you in first, which is that they have an incentive to be brutal because of nationalistic rhetoric that dehumanizes their enemies, because they have fear of an existential threat, which is why, for example, like the Sri Lankan army massacred many of the Tamils during the civil war. The fact that they have less training and therefore are less likely to use these weapons well, which means the effect of war crimes is likely symmetric. The way here, therefore, is on two things. The first is the cost. Because Yiing's analysis is that if it's true that US and China's incentive to do this is to access resources, then the incentive to give aid is also conditional on the US and China getting access to the same minerals that we're giving the PMCs on our side of the house. The delta, however, is that you have less bargaining power when negotiating with the US and China because you're dependent on them for a lot more things and because there are fewer alternatives. At least on our side, maybe you can still access like US and China for aid, but because you show a willingness to also contract with PMCs, the US and China have less bargaining power because you have more alternatives. You can get better deals to give up less resources. You end up giving up more resources in the same arms on their side. The second thing is the time lag. Vela explains the problem is that there's less political capital to send aid to countries, which means you have to wait a longer period of time until you can get the aid, which is when all the harm happens, which is why the insurgents are likely to win, which is when you get more collateral damage. The final thing then, are PMCs actually effective? We explained that PMCs have no incentive to prolong the conflict because they get access to the minerals either way. Prolonging the conflict just costs them more money because they have to spend more money on weapons, more money on soldiers. Now they can mine the resources in peace. Secondly, is that they're just more effective than state militaries because they have more training. Thirdly, like collateral damage, again, like the efficiency incentives still stand. Like raiding and killing villages takes more soldiers' time, requires more weapons, more ammunition, which costs money. If you're profit incentivized, you have no incentive to commit these war crimes because it's just not profitable to do so. For all those reasons, we're proud to propose.
Thank you everyone for a lovely debate. Judges will now deliberate.
seats for us.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for the finals round. Please enjoy the banquet lunch that we have provided to everyone. Results will be announced later at the awarding ceremony. We will be starting with the awarding ceremony shortly after. Also, the halal table is for the 4 tables in the middle. You will be served the halal food in that table. So please, participants who do not require halal food, please leave that space for our participants who require halal food. Thank you very much.